Hi everyone, today we're going to do a quick intro to the Industrial Revolution, which I know is a topic that you've studied in previous history classes. So this is just going to be a basic refresher and go pretty quickly. So first, we're going to look at what were the factors that led to the Industrial Revolution. The first major factor is the growth of technology. So the Industrial Revolution started in the textile industry, and there were a lot of new inventions during this time that allowed the weaving of cloth to move from being handmade at home to being made in factories by machines. One example is the spinning jenny, which is at the bottom in the middle. So previously, thread would be spun on a wheel, often by hand at home, usually by the woman of the household. This invention allowed them to be able to spin many spools of thread, as you see at one time. Also, the invention of the water frame. The water frame allowed people to put a water wheel next to build a factory next to a river, put a water wheel into the river that would turn as the river flowed and power the machines inside. Interchangeable parts is another important one, so that's represented by the picture in the bottom right corner. So the fact that machines were now produced with standard parts, so if something broke, they could easily be replaced. That was a new invention. And then the development of the steam engine by James Watt. And the picture right above interchangeable parts represents an early steam engine. So the steam engine burned coal, which produced steam and turned the engine and powered machines. And so this was really significant because it allowed factories to be located away from rivers for the first time. Another thing that allowed the Industrial Revolution to develop was geography. So the Industrial Revolution, it's important to note, first began in Great Britain in the 1700s. Because Europe already had a location on the Atlantic Ocean, it allowed them to gain natural resources from a lot of different places that they could use in their factories. Britain in particular had large deposits of coal, which was burned to fuel steam engines, iron, which could be used to build machines, and timber. And so countries like Britain, who had a lot of these resources, were able to develop and industrialize much more quickly. Britain also has a lot of rivers, and they also built a lot of canals, which are man-made waterways like you see at the bottom. And so that allowed them to be able to move products around. So even within Britain, from the areas where they had, say, a lot of coal mines to the areas where they built a lot of factories, rivers allowed them to be able to transport resources back and forth really quickly. Another key factor are new economic policies that helped Europeans create markets for their products and get supplies of raw materials. So we know by this point Europeans have colonies throughout the world, and mercantilism says that these countries in Europe should tightly control the trade of their colonies and use them to access raw materials, turn those raw materials into manufactured goods, and then sell them back to the people in the colonies. And so the system of mercantilism and the fact that Europeans had lots of colonies meant that they had access to raw materials and they had a place in which to sell all these manufactured goods once they were produced. Another key economic theory at the time is capitalism. So capitalism really developed officially during the Industrial Revolution. Capitalists are people who have acquired large amounts of capital or money needed to purchase the means of production. And the means of production is just whatever it takes to start the business. So it could be a factory building, the equipment, enough money to be able to pay the workers. And so in Britain especially, there were a lot of people who had saved up money to be able to start businesses. Another factor is population growth and demographic changes. So right before the Industrial Revolution in the 1600s and early 1700s, there was a wave of new technology in terms of agriculture. So the seed drill, which previously farmers would walk in a field and just scatter their seed by hand. The seed drill was something that you pushed along and it would plant your seeds neatly in rows, so it was much more efficient. They also experimented with new farming methods like crop rotation. And so all of these new things meant that agricultural production was increased. So they could grow more food with the same amount of land. We also know that New World crops such as the potato were already increasing populations in Europe. And so the fact that agriculture became more productive meant that there was a larger population available to work in other jobs. It also meant that some of those farmers just weren't really needed anymore. Farming became so productive that not everybody had to farm all the time in order to feed the population. And so it freed up people to go do other jobs. And that freeing up of people led directly to urbanization, because as not everyone needed to be a farmer anymore, a lot of people moved towards cities for new opportunities. And so people started to shift towards urban areas. Migration was also spurred by movements like enclosure, which eliminated the commons, leaving many poor farmers landless and in need of a way to support their families. So traditionally in Europe, most villages had a common area, which was a piece of land that was just owned by the village in general. And so people who were very poor, who didn't have their own land, could use that to graze an animal or use that to grow a little plot of food or something like that. And laws were passed in Europe that gradually got rid of the commons and they enclosed it, or meaning like they sold it off to someone. And so a lot of these very poor people who didn't own their own land were forced to move to the cities anyway to make a living. And so they became the new industrial workers. So now we're going to look at some more specific reasons why the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain. So it began in Great Britain in the 1780s, and one key reason for this is legal protection of private property. In Great Britain, their parliament had already passed laws that really encouraged business and protected entrepreneurs. So if you're going to start a business, which is risky, you're going to want to know that if you're successful, you can keep most of the profits from that, and they can't be taken from you under laws or anything like that. And so the fact that Britain already had laws in place that protected people's businesses meant people were more willing in Great Britain to take a risk to start a new business, which is what really fueled industrialization. Another key factor is that Britain was known throughout the world for its ships and its navy. And so the fact that it had a large fleet of ships allowed both raw materials and manufactured goods to be easily moved throughout the world. And so remember, we just talked a couple minutes ago about the use of colonies in industrialization. This was really important to Great Britain because they could import raw materials like, say, cotton from India from their colony, turn it into cotton textiles, and send it right back to India. Also, Great Britain had a large supply of capital or money. So their laws were such that people found it easier to save money in Great Britain than in some other countries. And so people who were a little bit better off, who were able to save enough money, were more encouraged to start a new business. Great Britain also had lots of natural resources, like I mentioned at the beginning. So they have lots of rivers, lots of coal, and lots of iron, which were all things that were essential to the Industrial Revolution. And this picture shows one of the things that's important about rivers. So this is an example of a water wheel, and you can see the factory would be inside. This water wheel would be attached to an engine or a machine, and it would power it as the river flowed and the water wheel turned. And then lastly, Great Britain had lots of markets to sell its products to throughout the world. So all the red areas are either Great Britain or its colonies. And you can see there's just lots of places where they're going to be able to take their goods and sell them to people. So the factory system is what developed with industrialization. Factories developed a whole new type of labor system. So owners wanted machines running at all times, and workers often worked in shifts, sometimes even around the clock, especially as electricity was developed. This led to a whole new social concept of time, because on the farm, which is where most people had come from before they moved to the cities, I mean, people pretty much their jobs were dictated by nature. Like when the sun comes up, that's when people go to work. When the sun comes down, that's when work ends. And so this idea of working on a particular schedule now that developed with the factory system was very different to a lot of people. So what challenges do you think workers might have faced in transitioning from farming to factory work? If you'd like to, you can pause the video and discuss that question. One of the things that's very different is that owners had to train workers to be on time and do repetitive tasks. So on a farm, your work is very much dictated by the season. You don't necessarily do the same thing all year. There's certain jobs that probably have to be done every day regardless of the season, but there's probably a lot more variety than there would be working in a factory. In a factory on an assembly line, you have to stand in one place all day, do the same thing over and over and over. You have a boss, whereas a lot of people who worked on farms didn't have as many regulations on them. So think again, if you work in a factory, you have to be on time. You can only take a break at this certain time. You can only eat at this certain time. You have to obey this person who's telling you what to do. So all of those kinds of things sound obvious to us that just comes along with getting a job. But this is very different for people who first went to the first factories. And so people have to be trained in order to understand and be able to do these things. The Industrial Revolution also created lots of problems in urban areas. So because so many people moved to cities so quickly, cities really couldn't keep up with the demand for housing. And so people lived in poorly built apartment buildings called tenements that were thrown up very quickly. They did not have building codes. Most of them didn't have running water or good sanitation. And so dirty and crowded living conditions often cause lots of disease outbreaks in cities. People also worked long hours away from home. Most of them worked 12 to 15-hour days, 6 days a week. The only day they had off was Sunday. And this really changed the family because if you think about it, on a farm, most people work with their family all day. And even maybe the men and women might be separated, but still, the boys would be out working with their father in the fields. The girls would be doing other household tasks with their mother, but they were with their family a lot. Now that people are moving and working in factories, even though children often went to work in factories, the family is very divided up, and they don't see each other like they used to. Also, low wages and harsh working conditions were problems. So at this time, there was no minimum wage, harsh working conditions. Often factory work was very dangerous. Remember, they're burning coal to fuel these factories, so there's a ton of pollution. It's hot. And there's no any kind of insurance. So if you get sick, if you get injured, they would just let you go and hire someone else. The Industrial Revolution also led to a new class structure. So previously in Europe, we pretty much had the landlords or the wealthy people who owned a lot of land, and then the peasants underneath them, okay? Now we have more of a specialization of labor, and we in urban areas have especially some different social classes developing. So the captains of industry or the wealthy owners of corporations became like the new elites. So whereas previously in Europe, to be an elite generally meant that you owned a lot of land and had a large estate, now a lot of times it means owning an actual business. We also have the development of a new middle class. So previously in Europe, there really wasn't much of a middle class. Again, you were either a lord or a peasant generally. Now we have a middle class, which might include people who own a smaller business and different kinds of skilled workers, like maybe a manager or someone who oversees other workers. And then we have the urban working class. So these would be factory workers, people that don't have a lot of special skills and are considered easily replaced. And that's the vast majority of the population. The Industrial Revolution also had a big impact on women. So for working class women, which would be lower class, a lot of them worked outside the home in factories. They were especially appealing to factory owners because they could legally be paid a fraction of the wage that men received. Middle class women, it was still seen as the ideal that they stayed at home and raise their family. And so this idea of women's place in the home is called the cult of domesticity. And it really idealized women's role as that of homemaker. So like a woman should be motherly and feminine and not really aspire to do anything outside of the home. So that was the middle class idea. Also during this time, by the late 1800s, there was increasing feminism. So feminism is the movement for women's rights. And as more women did work outside the home and took on more responsibilities, there began to be more of a call for expanded women's political rights, like voting. An example of this is the Seneca Falls Conference, which was the first basically women's conference in the world, which took place in 1848 in the United States. And even though women in the Western world did not get the right to vote until after World War I in the 20th century, the movements that eventually achieved that for women started during this time in the 1800s. There's also a second wave of industrialization called the Second Industrial Revolution. And this is just a period of huge technological change beginning around the 1860s on. So remember, the first industrial revolution we said started in Great Britain in the 1700s. This is the next wave. And so some characteristics: industrialization spread. So although industrialization started in Great Britain, it spread throughout the rest of Europe and eventually to the United States. And then reforms began to be made to combat some of the issues of the Industrial Revolution. So think about the suffering of the people in the factories and the working classes in cities. Governments slowly began to deal with some of those issues. There also were new forms of energy and fuel. So we learned about coal being the major fuel for the steam engine. That continued, but also oil and gasoline became an important source of fuel. The major industries that we're focused on, you should definitely write those down. So the major industries that became the focus of the Second Industrial Revolution would be steel, chemicals, and electricity. Steel, chemicals, and electricity. There also were a lot of new inventions, and they have to do with transportation and communication. So things like the radio, the internal combustion engine, which led to the development of the automobile, the light bulb, the telegraph, which allows you to send messages eventually pretty much anywhere in the world through Morse code, and the telephone. So like I said, part of the Second Industrial Revolution is that governments tried to make reforms to improve the lives of workers. So they created boards of health to monitor and try to improve sanitation. They developed for the first time building inspectors and building codes. So the tenements, which had been previously really unsafe, they tried to deal with those issues. So for example, new building regulations required things like running water and drainage systems in buildings. Sewer systems developed, which is what this image is showing. So they wanted to develop a way for people to remove waste from the cities. And things like police and streetlights made cities safer. So as all these people moved to cities, crime became a big issue, and so they were trying to deal with that issue. Governments also passed laws limiting the work of women and children in factories. So, for example, children in Great Britain under the age of 10 were no longer allowed to work in coal mines. Laws were also passed to make factories safer, and there were limited social welfare programs like housing and unemployment. That was very limited until the 20th century, but governments are still starting to move in that direction. The workers also responded by changing things for themselves. So this is how trade unions developed. Unions are organizations of workers who try to gain more pay and better working conditions by working together. And the idea with a union is that if one person from the factory goes to the boss and demands better conditions or better wages, it's unlikely that the boss is going to listen to just one person. But if the whole factory unionizes and goes to the boss and says, we're going to go on strike and we're not going to work anymore unless you improve things for us, they definitely have more of a shot of having their voice heard. And so in this picture, you see a group of workers striking and protesting their conditions and their wages. So the organization of unions was a way for workers to make change for themselves. And then the last key thing is socialism, and we're going to do a separate lesson on socialism and communism soon. But basically, the horrible living conditions of the Industrial Revolution gave way to socialism. Socialism is a system in which society, usually in the form of the government, owns and controls some of the means of production. And the means of production would be like the factories and machines. So the idea behind socialism is that the Industrial Revolution created more inequality in society because you have the factory owners who became very, very wealthy, and then the workers who are very, very poor. And so they're doing the labor, but they're not really getting a big benefit from that. And so socialism tries to fix that situation. So early socialism was developed based on the idea of equality, that people should cooperate to produce things rather than having to compete for jobs and markets in which to sell goods. So if people all own it together, own the factory together, then theoretically the workers would get a share in the profits, and it would be maybe not 100% equal, but it would be more equal than what was created with the Industrial Revolution. And like I said, you're going to do a lesson on this separate about socialism and communism where you'll look at this in more detail.